Haidong! So in this video, we're going to talk about how to draw the sword. The first step is obviously going to be just the placement of your swords. So if you didn't already watch that video, there are three distinct placements. You can start with your scabbard. I'm going to recommend keeping the bottom of the sword center, just because that's the most tactile. And since you're doing forms and doing draws and stuff like that, I'm going to suspect that you're going to be doing this from a form perspective, from a tactical perspective. So I'm going to use with the bottom of the sword keeping center line. The first draw is going to be just basic going into defense. So what I'm going to do is actually going to start closer to you and facing off this way. So the very first thing I want you to recognize is if you're here, again having the center line or the bottom of the sword on your center line. So what I'm going to do is keep my elbows close to me, right? So first of all, if my elbows are flared out, there's a lot less energy and a lot less power going forward, as opposed to if I'm tucked in, I have a lot more of that forward potential for momentum. So from here, again, make sure your thumb is keeping the scabbard closed or keeping the sword closed. That said, if you know this is really loose, you can also reinforce the inside of it. Have like a little piece of, I use yellow poplar on the inside of it, just kind of reinforce it so it doesn't fall out as much. But if you're here, you're going to bring your thumb in. So from the outside to inside to break that seal, right? And from here, using your pinky, then your ring, pinky, then the ring, then the middle, I'm going to place it 1, 2, 3, right? No, they have to be like thrumming, but focusing mostly on the pinky, keeping your elbows tucked in. You're going to draw it out, right? So obviously you can also grab, kind of over-exaggerating things. So draw it out. So as you're drawing out with your elbow tucked in and your left hand drawing the scabbard back as far as it can, you're going to keep that bottom of the sword center line. So as you draw forward, once it's almost popped out, you can pop it out, pinky, ring, middle. So pinky is going to keep it going forward, ring, middle, defense, into a guard. We're going to talk about the actual put away in a little bit, but for now, so you know, however you learned it, we're going to just go with that, like so. So now facing you, right? So same idea, right? So I'm facing you, center, right? I'm going to break the seal, elbows tucked in, pinky, ring, middle, drawing it forward. So notice I'm drawing the sword instead of jerking the sword out, right? There's going to be a very strong difference. So drawing the blade forward, keeping pulling the left hand in, pinky, ring, middle, guard. And also, so keep in mind for Gumdosa, the tip of our sword is going to be honed in on the throat. Now you're going to be seeing several different positions depending on people's backgrounds. So for example, if you're hardcore traditionalist Gumdo, you're going to have a really long reaching guard. If you're more from a Kendo background, you're going to have a much lower guard. And also notice that the tip looks like it's lower, but the idea behind it is a little bit different. The idea of this is the extension of the sword is honed at the throat. So for example, if someone's being silly, right? As opposed to for us, so Gumdo tend to be a little more on the defensive side. So our tip is at your throat level if you come at us, right? So if you're looking at Gumdosa, they tend to have what's called, I'm going to steal this from Hema, but Postalanga, so the long guard versus the short guard. Now both of these have good reasons. I'll go into that in a future video when I have students with which to practice because quarantine. But both of those have legitimate purposes. So if you're doing this from a Gumdo background, try the Gumdo guard, right? So it's going to be pushing more forward. The tip is actually at your throat level. If you're coming from this from a Yaido or Kendo background, you can have it lower, knowing that the extension of your sword is going through their throat. But yeah, either way, so defense, and then you're going to do your chakam, right? And we're going to talk about the chakam again in a little bit. But again, let's go through that a couple more times again without so much of a breakdown, right? So I'm going to be closer to you and a little bit faster, right? So if we're here, again, center, going to grab, pinky, ring, middle, drawing it back, defense, here. And then we're going to put the sword away. Same thing going forward, right? So again, break the seal, grab, elbow tucked in, drawing the sword forward, pinky, ring, middle, defense, and then chakam. Makes sense, right? So a couple other ways you can do this is to no longer going straight into a defense, I can go into a diagonal cut. So now notice, so this is going to be Exhibit A versus Exhibit B. Exhibit A, keeping the scabbard upright when I'm trying to do a diagonal cut, right? Versus turn the blade, right? So notice that this is actually nice because you can actually see this is actually, this used to be black, by the way, but I've worn it down with use. So you can actually track the white angle of this. So here, it's on an angle, I'm going to draw it. It's already on the correct angle, so it's a lot easier for you to draw. But let's try the same thing. It's going to be the exact same concept, right? So here, break the seal, elbows tucked in, drawing it forward, draw the scabbard back, pinky ring middle, cut down. And from there you can go into a defense. And if you want to, you can also focus and put away. 2 notes before we talk about the actual put away. So one is actually the placement of your scabbard when you have the sword out, and also the idea of the focus. So if you've been with the Federation for a very long time, you may potentially remember one way that we're taught to have the scabbard, but it's actually going back here. Now, back in the, so the reason I keep on saying back in the day is because, first of all, this is no longer canonical, right? So from the head, so from Korea, like I was actively corrected with this because I was at a test. I was like, oh, yo, I'm doing this right. And he's like, no, that way. It's like, okay. But, so again, if you were training with the Federation for a long time, you probably were taught to do this first. Probably for a few reasons, right? Because it kind of kept the scabbard out of the way, except for when you actually start doing cuts and you start banging against it, they probably found out that it doesn't work as nicely. But, so if you see someone doing this, first of all, most likely they're higher ranking than you are, so you're not in a position to correct them. But also, just understand that was the way, right? Now, I, again, was corrected by a very high-ranking person. So, what they want is actually going to be tucked in as far as you can at your hip. So notice this is not going to be the same as Yaido. So Yaido actually has it still a little bit in line with the side of your hip. Or even in some people actually keep it this far forward. We have it like embedded into our hip this way. For again, a couple reasons. We're going to be engaging more on angles and you know, shifting around. So if we have it here, that's going to kind of get in the way. We do a lot of uppercuts. Yaido doesn't do as many uppercuts, so that kind of gets in the way if we do a Yaido guard here. So if we have it tucked in here, we can do as many uppercuts to our heart's delight. It stays out of the way. We're generally good. So when you have your scabbard, make sure it's embedded, again, deep into your side of your hip. So not the front of your hip, right? So again, this is Yaido. So here, where pretty much the mouth is in line with the side of your hip this way. So then if you're here, then you're in defense. So one more thing that I mentioned was the focus. So now the focus is usually associated with Sangsu, so that's going to be our first set of forms. The idea of the focus is a little bit ambiguous, but from what I've understood and what I've discussed with other masters, is the idea of like, all right, so if you're not familiar, you usually do a focus at the end of a form, right? So just because form 2 is the first one we do it, so what we just did was we did a nice big clear, we're going backwards, everyone like enemies down, we focus, and then we do our put away, right? Now, what is this? Like, so what is this, right? Because if you don't know what you're doing, it's just kind of like, all right, is this like, you know, Babe Ruth being like, you did, haha. No, right? Because they did, they don't care. So the purpose of this, at least the way that I've kind of understood it, is it's getting you in tune with your weapon. Now it's kind of weird to have it at the end of a form as opposed to the beginning, but the best justification for that is if you do it in the beginning of your form, you're in the middle of combat, you don't have the time. First at the end, you kind of have time to focus. Another thing, so that's kind of okay, like that's an okay explanation. Another thing is you're literally just inspecting the blade, right? Because swords aren't magic. They bend, they crack, they chip. Stuff happens, right? So versus if you're here, you kind of like fall out, you kind of see like if there's any bends, like any warps in the blade. Now obviously not going to be like, right? But it's enough to be like, all right, like can I just put this away without like blowing up my scabbard? Right, I'm good, right? Everything's straight. I don't see like any major chips or anything like that. I'm going to put it away, right? Now that said, if this was the true intention, you can probably also do what you're supposed to do if you're inspecting a blade that someone offers you, right? Two-handed, kind of inspected this way, right? Now that said, obviously the blood, if there should be blood if you just did combat, would be dropping into your scabbard or into your hilt. You don't want that. But this is a quick way, like, all right, like, am I in the danger of destroying my scabbard? No. All right, so I'm gonna put the sword away, wipe it down, and put it away. One more thing you can do. So this is a little bit more in line with the idea of attuning yourself. Is just get used to the weight of the weapon, right? Because here, if it's a really, really long weapon, this is going to get you tired really, really quickly. But it's just getting you used to like the weight distribution, the center of balance, and all that kind of fun stuff. And this is kind of like in the position that's like most, I don't call it most painful, but you're most attuned to it. Versus this, you can kind of hold that for a long time. This kind of gets you used to like the weight, right? So this is a really uncomfortable position if you hold it for a very long time. So this gets you used to the weight of the sword, and from there it's like, all right, I'm good, and put it away. But for a side note, so this is going to be more of me as opposed to, again, Federation, which should be like every video should have that as an asterisk. But notice that we don't do focuses past 8, even including 8, right? So the idea, at least that from my understanding, is that you need, so as a newer swordsman, you need to get used to the weight of your weapon, right? So you just pick this up, you don't know how to use it that well yet, you have to get used to the weight of it. But once you hit 8, which is supposed to be your threshold for first degree, you should know how to hold a sword, right? So notice we don't do focuses past 8, right? Unless my brain's doing something really funky. Right, so the idea of this is that it's newbies getting used to a new weapon, right? That said, so usually at the end of a form, in the first 8, or first 7 actually, you're here, and then you can do your put away that's assigned to your form. Make sense? Drills. So, what I'd like you to try, so we just talked about how to draw the sword, so let's try drawing the sword into different things, right? So the first thing is just basic, just drawing the defense, right? So here, grab, draw, defense. We'll talk about how to put the sword away in a little bit, but just draw into defense, right? So what I'd also like you to try is drawing into a diagonal. So again, I mentioned this a little bit. Again, aiming with the bottom of the sword, right? So although you are my center line, I can actually draw here, aiming with the bottom of the sword over the corner of where I'm going to be striking, coming in, one-handed cut, defense, and then focus and chuck on. So that's another way you can try it. And the third one is actually going to be the beginning of your first couple forms, right? So the draw into crosscut. This is going to take a lot longer for you to get used to, just because there's a lot more moving parts, right? So what we did before was more or less draw, shuffle into a walking stance. So this one's going to have a little bit more involved with it. I'm going to try on the side first so you can kind of see. So the idea is, so if you really want a complete breakdown of this, you can think about stepping as you turn the blade, grabbing, drawing out. Again, notice I'm using my scabbard to pull back, pinky, ring, middle as I crosscut. So notice that my crosscut does not go all the way 180. Also because there's a wall there, but even if there wasn't a wall there, I don't want it to be at 180. Right, crosscut, grab, defense, and then again, chuck on. Now that said, that particular breakdown has absolutely no timing with it. So what I'd like you to try is actually break it down, well, not quite break it down, but try it this way. So as I'm sliding into my tato say, into my long stance, I'm going to be turning my blade, but I'm also going to be using the pinky to kind of run into it. So as I'm drawing into my tato, I'm going to be drawing, turning. So notice I'm just using the pinky, right? I'm not using that much more. Pinky here. So by the time I'm about in tato say, my blade or my foot is planted, my scabbard is pulled back, my sword is drawn, and as I kind of shift into an actual upright position, I can use the pinky ring middle, upright. So again, I mentioned that crosscut does not go full 180. Why? I need to know what I'm cutting, right? So in my periphery, I can cut as far as my periphery goes, but none farther, right? Because there might be someone that I know just past there that I'm just being like, yo, deadsies. You don't want that, right? Additionally, it's going to be better for your whole body. If I do this, there's going to be tension on my my front shoulder as well as my elbow. It's not good for you. Versus if I cut more forward here, again, noticing the tip is still a little forward, I can still see it in my periphery. Grab, defense. So let me show that again, just because that takes a little more time to digest it. So as I'm going into my potato say, right? So as I'm sliding in, twisting, putting my hand over here, right? And as I come upright, I'm going to use the pop. So pop the scabbard out, pinky ring middle. As I come upright with that cut, grab, defense, focus, and put it away. Make sense? So with that, so try those different kinds of draws, and just keep training and stay humble. Haidong!